Our next story, earlier this year, when Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer signed legislation that banned so-called conversion therapy. She said it was for the sake of children. But is there evidence of a rampant epidemic of counselors violating professional regulations and criminal law to abuse their patients? Well, the answer to that is no. So why does this legislation exist? Joining me now to discuss it is David Closson. He's the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview here at Family Research Council. David, welcome.
Great to be back with you, Joseph. Good to see you.
Well, good to see you. You are not in your normal D.C. confines. Before we get into the conversation, tell us a bit about what you're doing.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm coming to you from Atlanta right now. So FRC is one of the sponsors and exhibitors at what's known as G3 Ministries. So it's a conference that's attracted about 8,000 pastors and church leaders to hear from well-known preachers and pastors, really to get equipped for ministry and to be faithful in their local ministry context. And so it's just been a joy, Joseph. I'm here. One of the main speakers is our colleague, Owen Strachan, who's given 2 major talks on topics like Christian nationalism and church-state relations. And so it's been good to get out of D.C. for a little bit to just think biblically about the different issues we're dealing with in the public square, and to let people know that FRC's Center for Biblical Worldview is trying to provide resources to Christian parents and pastors and churches to just come alongside these groups to think biblically about all the issues we're dealing with.
Well, David, it is Friday afternoon and you are in Atlanta, so I know you're smart enough to know do not get in a car and try to go anywhere, so you are much safer conferencing. But let's get to our story today. Talked about this ban in Michigan about over-conversion therapy. Now, let's begin by defining terms. Now, in the Orwellian language of the left, the definition of conversion therapy is elastic enough to include trying to stop a child from mutilating his or her own body. But affirming care is when those healthy body parts are mutilated. Now, do you think that winning the language war and framing the issue in the way that the left wants to may be the actual purpose of the legislation?
Well, I think so, Joseph, and I think you had a piece in World Opinions where you talked about this, I think very helpfully, and I know that piece is on the FRC Worldview site. But I absolutely agree with you that what Gretchen Whitmer and other blue state governors and mayors are doing with these so-called bans on conversion therapy, this type of legislation is actually not really even necessary. This idea that you have these counselors or therapists that are engaging in so-called reparative or this kind of conversion therapy, it's actually not happening. However, this is an opportunity, I think the left is seeing, to co-opt the language to make it seem like this is happening, and that anyone who holds a worldview that would dare even suggest that these categories of sexual orientation and gender identity are problematic categories, well, these are just views that shouldn't even be given a proper hearing in the public square. And so what's problematic, especially, Joseph, is when this whole thing called conversion therapy, it's intentionally not defined. I looked at the governor's press release, and, it's intentionally not defined. And so often what this means is this even will include talk therapy or counseling. And so we've even seen this in places like Indiana, that they'll put these bans in place. And they'll even say that if you are a Christian counselor or pastor, you can't talk about these issues. And that's usually has to be walked back. But I do think the analysis you're giving, Joseph, is a very helpful one.
Yeah. And I want to let Governor Whitmer kind of describe why she thinks this is necessary. She actually did take to social media to describe why she thought this was helpful. Let's play clip 6.
Conversion therapy is an abusive process used to try and control children. It's anti-medicine, anti-choice, and it's just plain wrong. So I'm proud that we're finally banning conversion therapy in Michigan. And I want the LGBTQ+ community to know that I've got your back. We will continue taking action to make our state a place where anyone can build a brighter future.
Now, there's some history here that I think is important because in some ways there's actually a lot of agreement between the right and the left on this issue. Because the left, and I think Gretchen Whitmer, what she's referring to there, is there have been stories told about things like shock therapy and ice baths being provided to children in an attempt to make them, change their desires. And the reality is, across the board, across the political spectrum, across the religious spectrum, it has been widely condemned. I don't know of anybody who says, oh, yeah, that's a really good idea. We should do that to people, which just demonstrates that that's not actually happening. Furthermore, if it were happening, it may already be covered by criminal abuse, child abuse laws, because there are criminal statutes that say you can't abuse children, thankfully, and everyone supports those. In addition, there are also professional ethics and professional rules that if a counselor for any purpose tries to coerce a client to accomplish the therapist's goals rather than the client's goals, that's professional misconduct. You can report that conduct to the governing board of the profession, and the therapist can lose their license. But significantly, in Governor Whitmer's press release about this, she pointed to no examples of this happening anywhere in Michigan, which is notable because if there were examples, you can be sure that she would talk about it incessantly because it fits the narrative. So to that point, and again, this is worldview, but it's also politics, understanding how this stuff is done. What I think they want to happen through this legislation is to create the impression that abuse is happening when it isn't. Because when the governor goes out and makes this big scene, oh, we've passed this legislation to end this abuse, all that does is tell, well, of course we don't want children being abused. That must mean those mean fundamentalist Christians who don't think men can become women are abusing children. When there's no evidence that that's happening, but you've kind of now planted the seed. Is this a bit of when did you stop abusing your wife?
Well, I think so, Joseph, and I think what you just said is so key. If there was an example that the left could point to, all of us would know those individuals by name. It would be on cable news 24/7. And so let's just be clear from a worldview perspective. There were stories, from the 70s and 80s of people doing like electric shock therapy and aversion therapy and things like that. That's been widely discredited by everybody. No one thinks, like you said, that's a good idea. There is no ministry. There is no pastor. There's no church that I know that thinks this is the answer for a child struggling or confused about gender dysphoria or sexual orientation. So let's be clear, this is not happening. But what Gretchen Whitmer and others are doing, they're able to poison the well and to be able to get this narrative going that you fundamental Christians who maybe disagree with the categories of gender dysphoria or gender identity, sexual orientation, it's not just a outdated, backwards understanding, but it's inherently subversive and dangerous. And so I think we need to realize this fits with the leftist narrative. This comes from a leftist worldview. And again, we need to, as Christians, say, we stand for children and we stand for what is actually right for children. And we need to see through the politics here.
And you hinted at something else that I think we should highlight as well, is that while the conversation around these bills always has to do with abuse, and everybody believes that child abuse needs to stop, right? Bipartisan agreement around that point. But what this legislation ends up doing is it allows the government to censor and punish conversations that happen in a therapeutic context. So what they say is, don't abuse children. Oh, and if you tell a kid who experiences gender dysphoria that it's possible to become comfortable with the body that God gave him, that's conversion therapy. You can't do that. So what they're really trying to do is regulate conversations. A silly analogy that I think is actually useful, though, is if you pass legislation to say, let's stop wives from beating their husbands over the head with frying pans, we'd all say, yes, we need to stop wives from beating their husbands over the head with frying pans. But then you look in the language and it says, it actually also tells wives that they can't tell their husbands to pick up their socks. And so that's a totally different thing, but that's kind of the game that's being played here, is we want a headline that everybody agrees with in order to accomplish a purpose that is actually quite problematic and to the point of free speech that we talked about earlier in the show. But David, I want to switch topics with you because it's kind of related, but the Pew Research Center has recently published some results regarding Americans' view on the family. Now, it turns out that more Americans are pessimistic about the institution of marriage and the family these days. It says 40% of Americans are pessimistic about the direction of the family in America. Only 25% are optimistic. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, this is so interesting, Joseph. Only 40% it's 40% that are pessimistic. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. We know that the divorce rate in this country is extremely high, and not just in the general public, but also in the church. I think we're seeing a crisis of fatherlessness in this country. So I do think that there's a lot of people in and outside the church that are inherently pessimistic about institutions like marriage. And I don't think that's a good development. But again, we're seeing that, Joseph. I think this is ultimately the fruit of the undermining of the institution of marriage. First, going all the way back to 1969 with the first no-fault divorce law, just generation after generation, it seems we have undermined marriage. We've undermined this institution. We've redefined marriage, obviously, in the Obergefell decision in 2015. And so I think what we're seeing now, this people not being sure about marriage, confused about marriage, pessimistic about marriage, this is the fruit of decades of where we've been undermining and delegitimizing the institution of marriage.
And it is interesting as the progressives have kind of gotten their way culturally in terms of how people view and understand the family and marriage. Americans do not become more optimistic about what that apparently means. Because, of course, this is not primarily a political question. It's just what's your mood about how the family's doing? And in general, the mood is not positive. But the survey also asks people what they think about the specifics of the family. 49% of Americans said that fewer children being raised by two parents is negative, which is half of America thinks it's a problem that fewer children are being raised by two married parents. But there's another number here that I want to highlight. 39% of Americans think that fewer children being raised by two married parents is neither positive nor negative. That's almost 40% of Americans who think it's no big deal that fewer children are being raised by their mother and father. What do you attribute that to?
Well, once again, Joseph, I think key to this is that people are not understanding the good things that a married mother and a father bring into that relationship. We saw this last year with the debate about the so-called Respect for Marriage Act, people not understanding the goods of marriage, the stability of marriage, that this is good for children. And, it's interesting that other cultures, even non-Christian cultures, have long understood this. Yeah. But increasingly, Carl Trueman's book, I think, is really helpful, that we've elevated the self above all things. And so with this elevated view of the self, we're all of a sudden now not thinking marriage and commitment and responsibility are important things. There's another part of this study showed that 71% of Americans said that having a career was a key to a fulfilling life. 61% said that having close friends was key to having a fulfilling life. Only 23% said that it was marriage that was key to having a fulfilling life. And so I think when we've elevated the self, the urges of adults and the desires of adults, kind of putting me, myself, and I above family and above marriage, these are the kinds of things you see. These are the fruit of the bad ideas we've been sowing now for decades related to marriage and family.
And David, the partisan differences here are really interesting as well. The idea that fewer children being raised by two parents is a problem. 63% of Republicans think it's a problem. Only 37% of Democrats think it's a problem. Fewer people getting married. 52% of Republicans think that's a problem. Only 23% of Democrats think that's a problem. More couples living together without marriage. 44% of Republicans think that's a problem. 15% of Democrats do. People having fewer children in general. 37% of Republicans think that's a problem. 20% of Democrats do. it's very clear that the worldview divide between the right and the left, and it's imperfect, and there's certainly overlap, and not everybody on the left is far away from everybody on the right, and there's certainly a spectrum here. But it seems that progressivism causes people not just to feel differently about the family, but they value family different, they value marriage different, and they value children differently. And that gets to the worldview of what do we think the purpose of our life is. David, sadly, we're out of time. There's so much more to dig into, but we're going to have to do it another day. Enjoy the rest of your time in Atlanta, and thanks for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Joseph.